From Lagos, the nation's commercial capital, this is the News at 10. Live from Channels Television. Reporting tonight, Amarachi Ubani.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight, Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 asks those in the front line of the pandemic fight to adequately protect themselves as over 40 health workers test positive for coronavirus. ECOWAS leaders are asked for the cancellation of debts owed by African countries following the harsh economic conditions created by the coronavirus pandemic. Also appoint President Buhari champion of COVID-19 response. Minister of Foreign Affairs talks tough on the ill treatment of Nigerians and other Africans in China. Says Nigerians and other African countries are set to address the matter head-on. And a first human trial in Europe for coronavirus vaccine begins in the United Kingdom as first two volunteers of over 800 people recruited for the study get injected. Plus business news from the FCT and later from our studios in London.
On Business News tonight, former Managing Director of the World Bank, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, urges commodity-dependent African countries to restructure their economies to reduce the impact of the slump in global oil price.
On Sports News tonight, the league management company confirms there are no plans to cancel the 2019-2020 Nigeria Professional Football League season.
And from Abuja, Governor Bala Mohammed imposes partial lockdown in Bauchi State, bans the artillery system as well as motorcycle operations.
The Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 today continued its daily briefing on how Nigeria is containing the spread of the coronavirus with a call on workers in the front line to take personal protection seriously. This is coming on the heels of the confirmation by the Minister of Health that more than 40 medical officials have tested positive to the dreaded virus. The warning to health workers concern the non-compliance with the directives to refer all suspected cases to accredited isolation centers and an appeal to Muslims to observe the upcoming Ramadan prayers at home formed part of the conversation at the briefing today.
We'll take the Minister of Information and
Members of the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19, led by the chairman who doubles as the secretary to the government of the Federation, are here to update journalists about how the government is handling the pandemic.
May I now invite the
First to speak is the chairman of the task force, who expresses dissatisfaction with the way private hospitals are treating the directives to refer all suspected cases of COVID-19 to accredited treatment centers.
The Presidential Task Force views with some measure of concern the non-compliance by private medical facilities with the directive to seek accreditation before treating COVID-19 related cases.
While commending health workers for their sacrifices, the Minister of Health appeals to these frontline workers not to treat the advice for personal protective equipment against the virus with levity.
I applaud all our health workers in the front lines of COVID-19 pandemic, and the government will continue to provide you with the necessary personal protective equipment. I urge you all to take the necessary precautions for your own safety. Please do not try to treat patients without using adequate PPE, and frontline workers must undertake refresher courses, training in IPC at intervals. This advice is necessary due to the number of health workers who are tested positive. There are over 40 now, or others who have had to be quarantined in the last two weeks due to exposure and are therefore not able to contribute to the health sector effort.
The task force also notes that there is urgent need to scale up testing in some states while endorsing the interstate lockdown to prevent further spread of the virus.
Of course, every state was also struggling
with how to use their human resources and how to repurpose individuals doing different things. So developing staff capacity in IPC, in contact tracing and surveillance, in managing health, managing patients safely. All these were ideas that were shared. There are many aspects of the response that had gone well. There are others that were scaling up. Very soon we'll also be in the same position with Kano, improving from an initial bumpy ride to a much more smoother response.
We are particularly pleased to note the decision by the Nigeria Governors Forum to restrict interstate travel. This is really important when it comes to reducing the risk of interstate spread and transmission of the virus.
Currently, the Nigeria Center for Disease Control says it has the capacity to test over 1,000 samples per day, but the challenge is that of low response from the general public.
As COVID-19 rages around the world, West African leaders are calling for the cancellation of all debts owed by African countries. The request was made by the President of Niger and Chairman ECOWAS Heads of State and Government, Mr. Mahamadou Issoufou, at the opening ceremony of a teleconference extraordinary ECOWAS summit on COVID-19. During the teleconference summit, ECOWAS leaders also appointed President Muhammadu Buhari as the champion of the COVID-19 response. Our correspondent, Kayla Megwa, reports.
Since Africa's index case of COVID-19 in late February of 2020, Africa has so far recorded over 26,000 cases and over 1,200 deaths from the disease. The ECOWAS sub-region, with 15 countries, has so far recorded over 5,500 cases and over 150 deaths from the coronavirus. The wish is for these figures to reduce, and to do that, the ECOWAS heads of state called for an extraordinary summit on COVID-19.
Chairman, sir.
A moment of silence is observed for the dead.
I am being told. Thank you.
The conversation moves to the support needed by different sectors of the economy of the sub-region following the pandemic. The chairman ECOWAS heads of state and government, President Mahamadou Issoufou, calls for structures to cushion the effect of the virus economically, including the cancellation of all debts owed by African countries.
The approach needed to be undertaken with regards to cancellation of debts of member states and also other countries on the continent.
Member countries agree on the establishment of a technical working group to look at the effects of the pandemic on the people of West Africa, as well as a clear recovery plan after the crisis. They ask countries to share their experiences in combating the pandemic.
It will be important for us to adopt specific measures for greater regional collaborative initiatives in order to further protect our population from the devastating effects of COVID-19, especially those that are most vulnerable.
We need to mobilize all the social forces in our country to be able to do so, calling upon religious, traditional, academic, scientific, political, and civil societies all to come together in an all-Ghana approach to deal with the threat.
Member countries then appoint President Muhammadu Buhari as the COVID-19 champion, expected to coordinate the response of the region to the pandemic.
So I see there's no objection to President Buhari, so we accept that President Buhari is champion to coordinate the COVID-19 response. Thank you very much, President Buhari.
The meeting comes to an end after hours of discussions. President Buhari's media advisor speaks on the deliberation.
Our president is going to lead the response of West Africa to the challenge of COVID-19.
The years of neglect of the health sector in Africa has been exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The drive now is a continent-wide approach towards prevention from massive infections and deaths due to this disease, as the health systems on the continent may not be able to handle that catastrophe. Kayla Megwa, Channels Television News.
West African leaders are not the only ones concerned about debts incurred by African countries. Nigeria's former finance minister, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, has also revealed that the African Union envoys are already looking for a debt relief of 2 years for African countries so they can raise enough resources to cushion the effects of COVID-19 on their economies. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala explains that the envoys are already raising more resources for African countries in the wake of the coronavirus.
Governments have tried to practice that. It's actually quite courageous because when you do lockdowns on our continent, it's very difficult on people because many people earn their living on a daily basis. They have to go out and work to feed their families. So when you say lockdown, it means they can't earn anything. And they are wondering, how are we going to eat today? So you hear people talking of hunger virus killing them before coronavirus. So yes, the measures have been taken, but we need to do more and we need to get additional resources. This virus is a pandemic. It's a global problem. On the economic front, the governments of Africa, on average, have tried to do fiscal stimulus which amounts to about 0.8% of GDP. This is 1/10 of what has been done in the G7 countries. Their own goes from 8 to 10% of GDP, and Japan has even gone as high as 20%. So that means we don't have the fiscal space to be able to do more, meaning we don't have enough resources and revenues. And this is why it's important to try and raise additional resources for the continent outside. As AU envoy, along with 3 other colleagues, we are working really hard to see what types of resources we can raise. Part of it is asking for a debt standstill for 2 years, so countries don't have to pay, so they can use the resources to feed people, to make sure they have money in their pockets to buy the necessary equipment needed.
Well, earlier today, the Presidential Task Force held its daily briefing in the nation's capital, Abuja. One of the issues raised was the reports of inhumane and racist treatments meted on Nigerians and other Africans in China. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jeffrey Onyema, says Nigeria is extremely disappointed in the way China is treating its citizens and that they are taking definitive steps at addressing the matter.
We've made it clear to the Chinese government in no uncertain terms, unequivocally, that under no circumstance will we accept racial discrimination against Nigerians or indeed Africans or blacks in China. That is a red line for us. They have in turn told us that there is no case of that ongoing. But clearly, we are seeing videos. I have received reports, and we've told them it's unacceptable. And, we're also engaging with other African countries to decide and work together on definitive steps and measures that we will take because of this situation. In addition, I have directed our consulate in Guangzhou to systematically detail every single case of discrimination and every single case of loss or damage suffered by any Nigerian. And we will pursue each and every single one very robustly with the Chinese government. If it requires, compensation and damages, etc. So for us, as I said, it's a red line, and we're going to fight it to the very end.
In part 2, after the break, I'll be talking more on the conversation surrounding debt relief for African countries. I'll be joined on the news at 10 by development economist Professor Ken Ike from our studios in Abuja. Stay with us. Welcome back. If it has joined us, you're watching the news at 10 live on Channels Television, reporting from Lagos. A reminder of our top stories. Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 asks those in the front line of the pandemic fight to adequately protect themselves as over 40 health workers test positive for coronavirus. ECOWAS leaders ask for the cancellation of debts owed by African countries following the harsh economic conditions created by the coronavirus pandemic. Appoint President Buhari champion of COVID-19 response. Minister of Foreign Affairs talks tough on the ill treatment of Nigerians and other Africans in China. Says Nigeria and other African countries are set to address the matter head-on. And first human trial in Europe of a coronavirus vaccine begins in the United Kingdom as first 2 volunteers of over 800 people recruited for the study get injected. Plus, that's news from Abuja, the FCT, and later from our studios in London. Our website, channelstv.com, has more information on our top stories and others. Subscribe and watch Channels Television's live stream on YouTube and other social media platforms using your mobile device browser, or download the Channels TV app for Android and iOS devices from their respective stores. You can also watch us via your smart TV platforms using on Apple TV, Android TV, Fire TV, and Roku. Before the break, we talked about debt relief African leaders have been asking for, and some voices have come up supporting this move. Let's examine the issue of debt owed by African countries and the call for cancellation and freeze. We're now being joined live from our Abuja studios by a developmental economist, Professor Ken Ife. Thank you for joining us on the News at 10.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
How would you react to this call for the cancellation of debt owed by African countries at this time? Do you think it's realistic?
It's excellent. It's realistic. In fact, that should be the starting point. This is a negotiation. You take extreme positions. You ask for total debt cancellation. They will say, well, we are prepared to talk about moratorium. Now, they've met us in between, somewhere in between, where they are prepared to forgive some of the debt service, not the principal. But what worries me about this is I can see the macroeconomic framework with which we are negotiating in the middle ground. UNECA says, one of the directors says, this should reflect on the depth of the crisis of the member states. I mean, if you look at America, America's intervention, 2.2 trillion, is 12% of their GDP. UK, 330 billion, that's 15% of their GDP. Japan, 20%. Where Nigeria, with our 3.5 billion plus trillion plus 500, is around 4%. So then if you look at other indicators like debt to GDP ratio, the total debt of the country, what are the framework? How are we going to do that? Okay, let's look at West Africa. The West Africa total GDP together is just over 600 billion, about 612 billion. The debt is about 220 billion. That's roughly 1/3. Nigeria obviously accounts for 66% of the whole GDP at $400 billion. But we also account to nearly half of the debt. But we're still around 20, just a little over 20% debt to GDP ratio. But there are countries like Cape Verde, that's 125%. And Ghana sits in the middle with 60% debt to GDP. But that's not the only measure. The deficit, all of us are in the red in the ECOWAS. But the best is actually Togo, which is less than -1. It's about -0.6. And Nigeria comfortably sits at about 3%, which is where the law says you can't exceed 3% deficit to GDP. But there is Ghana that's around 7%. So that's what I was saying. I was coming down to this. What are we using to negotiate? China says we are prepared to forgive, to move on the debt service, but not touching the principle at all. And they're even saying that it has to be on a case-to-case basis. So we need to have a framework, to make sure China doesn't tear all of us apart, because it's easier it's easier for us to say in the middle ground, let's have refinance the debts at 0%. That means effectively waiving the debt service. And then from there, we'll begin to say, okay, if you won't have a 0 for everybody, refinance at 0, then additional debt at 0, then what are we talking about? And it's not unexpected because the development finance institutions have cases where they do zero interest and 5-10-year moratorium. So I think we should, in that middle ground, we should press for that 0, and then while we are discussing that, find and develop some sound macroeconomic framework to apply that, rather than what China is trying to do.
Yeah, and you make a very strong case about, this point of negotiation for African countries. Some are seeking a freeze of the debt, some are saying a not total cancellation. And then you don't think it would be unfair, to these institutions to have to forgive these debts. And besides, what negotiation, what point of negotiation are we arguing this from? What do we have as to advantage in this conversation?
Well, we're a weaker party in this negotiation, but there's a much more moral justification for us to ask for 100% debt cancellation. I mean, in 2005, there were debt cancellations of large magnitudes, except that Nigeria had to put 12 billion down to be able to get the 18 billion debt relief. So we have to ask, because the impact is going to affect our trading relationships, our capacity to trade with the West and those other countries, and it's going to affect, it will just upset the whole global economy as we know it. So we're moving into uncharted territory. So there's nothing wrong in asking. I'm pressing for that. And they themselves know that they need us as much as we need them. We are the last frontier, and we have the momentum in Africa in terms of growth. And we should press for the case. If they think otherwise, then we have a stronger case to trade more seriously among ourselves. Because at the moment, what we have is north-south trading relations rather than horizontal relations in the Africa configuration.
Well, what does it do to our economy if eventually we don't make a strong case for this, and even though we do make a strong case, these institutions refuse to grant debt relief?
No, I think we'll keep fighting because there are sympathies. The G20s have already agreed 1 year and with the option of 2 years. You just have to press, because let me tell you the danger. If you don't negotiate that, and then you have a higher degree of fiscal stress that can arise when you begin to have debt, the ranking goes down. Once you miss payments, your ranking will go down, and then it's more difficult for you to borrow more. Even if you borrow at a higher cost, and we can do with that. And look at the case of Nigeria. We know that our debt service is more like just over 2 trillion. If you remove that, then that nearly equates what we're expecting from oil. So if the crude can be offset by a postponement or a cancellation of the service, then, it is a neutral position for Nigeria. All we now do is to focus on all the other things that are emergent, which is the focus of the CBN-led effort of the private sector to capitalize the opportunities presented by COVID-19, and especially where the private sector says we want to float a $50 billion infrastructure company to take the bull by the horn and then support the whole effort. So there are many initiatives that are coming up. We've just seen the CBN launch their 3-year Marshall Plan. And it's very encouraging. And I think this is a...
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry for interrupting.
It's a big opportunity for Nigeria.
Great, indeed, and we do hope that everyone wins at the end of the day. Thank you again, Professor Ken Ife, a developmental economist, for joining us on the News at 10.
My pleasure.
The chairman of the Diaspora Commission, Mrs. Abike Dabiri Erewa, says the Lebanese government has arrested one Mr. Will Jero, who allegedly put up for sale a Nigerian lady by the name Busari Peace. Calling it heartwarming news, she thanked the Lebanese government for swinging into action immediately the incident occurred. Jero had marketed Miss Peace along with her Nigerian passport on a Facebook webpage, putting a price tag of $1,000 on the 30-year-old Ibadan indigene. The Lebanese government announced that the culprits will be prosecuted for alleged criminal sale of a young Nigerian girl, and Mrs. Dabirawa says the Nigerian government is interested in the case and will see it through. Also, the Commission has disclosed that the federal government has secured the release of 60 out of 73 Nigerians serving various jail terms in Tanzania prisons. It explained that the Nigerian mission in Tanzania had been working on the repatriation of Nigerian prisoners in that country before the COVID-19 pandemic. In Bauchi State, Governor Bala Mohammed has placed a ban on commercial motorcycle operations, popularly called Ochaba, in the state, and the Almajiri system of learning. The governor announced the ban during a statewide broadcast, where he also imposed a partial lockdown on the state. The template for the partial lockdown includes the suspension of Friday congressional prayers, church services, all social gatherings, Ramadan sermons, the Muslim retreats, and the vigil prayers for the month of Ramadan. But the Muslim 5 daily prayers will continue in the mosque, except that they will be shortened and performed within one's vicinity. Markets will also be shut down, except for those selling essential commodities. Let's go back to Abuja now, where Linda Akibe is standing by with more on the news at 10. Hi, Linda.
Hello, Amarachi. Now, staying with the northern part of the country, more than 30,000 Almajiri children have been sent out of Kaduna State as part of measures to contain further community transmission of COVID-19. The State Commissioner for Human Resources and Social Development, Hafsat Baba, says the action is to ensure that the vulnerable Almajiri children do not pose a threat to the battle against the deadly disease. A woman assaulted by some police officers in Osun State for allegedly flouting the stay-at-home order is demanding for justice and wants the Inspector General of Police, Abubakar Adamu, to ensure that her assaulters are made to face the wrath of the law. The victim, Mrs. Halima Abdul Aziz, said she was accosted and beaten by the police officers on her way to get medical help for her ailing daughter at Odori in the Iwo axis of the state. She alleged that the officers were aided by other man-o'-war officers to inflict unlawful physical assault on her because they failed to listen to her explanations on her reason for coming out during the lockdown. Meanwhile, the State Police Command said an investigation has been launched into the allegation with the promise that the matter won't be swept under the carpet.
This release is important as a call on the Inspector General of Police to stand against the gross violation of the rights of Nigerian citizens, particularly those of women and girls, by unscrupulous officers who claim to be officers of the law and members of Nigerian police. I do not consider this as an attack on one woman. Rather, it is an attack on all Nigerian women. It is an attack on humanity. It is an attack on survivors of physical and sexual violence. It is an attack on women working to protect women. It is an attack on women's rights. It is an attack on harmless citizens. It is an attack on justice, and there must be consequences.
When the news at 10 returns, we have more updates on COVID-19. Plus, former Managing Director of the World Bank, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, asks community-dependent African countries to restructure their economies to reduce the impact of the slump in global oil price. That's in business news. Join us again.
Welcome back. The Sultan of Sokoto and Chairman of the Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs in Nigeria, Abubakar Sayat III, has announced the sighting of the Ramadan crescent today. A sighting of the new crescent moon marks the beginning of the Ramadan fasting. While announcing the developments in Sokoto, the Sultan says the crescent was sighted in different parts of the country. Therefore, he has declared Friday as the first day of Ramadan for the Islamic 1441 after Hijrah. Now, the real estate and property development company Lekki Gardens Estate Limited has donated food supplies to over 1,000 families as part of its own contribution to mitigating the impact of COVID-19 on homes. The Chief Engagement Officer, Lekki Gardens, Romeo Akinwade, says the items would be distributed to households in Awoyaya, Parapo, Lakwe, Olokunla, Alabeko, Owode and Aja communities in Lagos State.
While the impact of the COVID-19 outbreak continues to bite harder, it may also be getting tougher for some families, many of whom were already barely making ends meet. This informed the decision by Lekki Gardens to step in and ensure that no one is left behind by providing food items such as yam, bags of rice, cartons of noodles, groundnut oil, and seasoning cubes. Over 1,000 families across 7 communities where the company's estates are located are to benefit from this gesture.
Given that we are all in this together, our organization is also standing together with the government to ensure that we leave no one behind. Hence, we appreciate all who are partnering with us in this initiative to touch as many lives as possible. At an average of 4 persons per household, we are actually supporting and touching the lives of over 4,000 persons across the 7 communities in this our modest intervention.
A representative of the host communities responds on behalf of the people.
A lot of people are on the street now looking for food around everywhere, but at least this one can still support people to know that they can still cook something at home. And I'm really happy. I appreciate what they're doing. And on behalf of Kabiyesi Lubishi, entire of Ikate land, we are thanking them for all what they are doing.
The Chief Engagement Officer reiterates the company's commitment to assist the vulnerable through compassionate actions, even in the face of the crisis.
A lot of people are going through very difficult times. They are going through hard times. And the least we can do is to come out and see how we can support the most vulnerable within our communities. So that is why we're doing what we're doing. And it is part of our culture as an organization. We care about people. We care about our people who work with us. We care about the communities that we build.
With many Nigerians seeking palliatives at this crucial time, Lekki Gardens is optimistic that this action will help to reduce the impact of the lockdown on the people.
Meanwhile, President Muhammadu Buhari is cautioning against actions that can spread coronavirus as Muslims in Nigeria join their counterparts around the world to welcome the Ramadan fasting. The president said in a congratulatory message to Muslim faithful that this year's Ramadan is a big challenge as it is coming at a period of the global pandemic. He advises faithful to avoid large gatherings and should try to have their prayers and meals individually or with their family at home. The president asked them to endure and not use the coronavirus as an excuse not to participate in the Ramadan fast unless such abstention is warranted by the excuses clearly outlined by health and religious authorities. The oil and gas sector in Nigeria, led by the Minister of State for Petroleum, Timothy Silva, has donated medical items and ambulances to the Lagos State government and other southwest states. The Petroleum Minister says all the southwest states will get a fully equipped ambulance each and other medical consumables.
Lagos State is in the news again, just as it continues to combat the deadly coronavirus pandemic, and it's for a great good. The oil and gas industry, led by the Minister of State Petroleum, the GMD and MPC, heads of agencies, are joined by the State Minister for Health as Lagos State and 5 other Southwest take delivery of 6 ambulances and critical health items to fight COVID-19, courtesy of the oil industry.
Thank you very much. NMPC and its partners under the umbrella of the Independent Petroleum Producers Group, IPPG, are distributing the following items: 5 Toyota ambulances,
2,500 respiratory face masks, 5,000 pieces of safety goggles, and 5,000 pieces of protective body suits.
I can see that very quickly you all came together to do this and to have a voice in this all-important global issue. I want to assure you, I have my Deputy Incident Commander who is leading the conversation in Lagos, Professor Abayomi here, that they will put it to judicious use and that we will ensure that all of the items will be delivered to the respective states, and so they will go immediately to the front line.
Socioeconomic realities have become a fallout of the lockdown owing to the pandemic. So at the distilled level, host communities to entities of the oil industry supporting the fight get some food items.
This initiative of the oil and gas industry is highly commendable. And I thank you very much on behalf of the Presidential Task Force.
The intervention of the sector in supporting the fight against COVID-19 has been put at $58 million. Olu Phillips, Channels Television News.
Let's delve more in the world of business. Here's BC Adebayo. Business news. The former managing director of the World Bank, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, has been speaking on what commodity-dependent African countries must do to minimize the impact of the slump in global oil price. Earlier today on our program, Business Morning, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala says countries such as Nigeria has to restructure the economy so as to create multiple sources of revenue.
There'll be business cycles, there'll be cycles with commodity prices. So what you also need to do is to make the economy less dependent on these commodities. And that is why, for the longer term, restructuring the economy so that you can also have other sources that can create jobs for people, other sources where you can tap revenues. Part of the issue, let's take Nigeria or some other African countries. Our economies have a lot of sectors that are quite diverse. We've got agriculture, we've got tourism, we've got creative industries. I think learning how to tax some of these other sectors better, manufacturing, you have to look all across the board and say, are we getting enough resources from this sector? So it's not just diversifying your economy, you also have to diversify your sources of revenue, meaning you have to tax better.
Meanwhile, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala is also advocating the launch of a global vaccine bond on the capital markets to help curb the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. She explains that the proposed debt instruments will allow most countries, particularly developing nations, access to the vaccine when it's eventually found and approved. In other news now, 2 mobile harbor cranes have been added to the investment of APM terminals in Apapa Port in Lagos, southwest Nigeria. The tools are meant to increase the number of vessels handled daily in the terminal, as well as decongest the port for easy operations. The managing director of Nigerian Ports Authority, Ms. Hadiza Bala Usman, says this is part of the big plan to expand operations at ports all over the country.
With operations still on at the ports for the sustenance of the economy, social distancing is obvious as the executive of the Nigerian Ports Authority and APM terminal, as well as members of the Maritime Workers Union, gathered to witness the addition of 2 mobile harbor cranes to the investment in the ports in Lagos. This is part of a $80 million short-term investment by APM terminals for faster handling of vessels in the recently recorded growth in trade.
In the name of God and to the benefit of Nigerians in the maritime sector.
The Managing Director of Nigerian Ports Authority, Ms. Hadiza Bala Usman, leads the commissioning of the cranes and gets a hands-on experience of the equipment. The value expected from this addition is to be felt in the daily running of the port.
Within the period in the last 3 months, they have improved. They have brought in 9-number equipment. They have brought in cranes to enable them evacuate those cargo. And today we've just commissioned 2. So I'd like to reiterate that Nigerian Port Authority is strong in regulating and ensuring that all terminal operators adhere to the infrastructural deployment and equipment deployment within the concession agreement.
The Port Authority recorded a cargo throughput of 38.5 million metric tons in the first half of 2019, compared with 35.9 million metric tons over the corresponding period of 2018, an indication of the importance for tools which will accelerate operations in the nation's seaports.
Let's head to the markets now as investors at the Nigerian equities market lost over 161 billion naira today. Temple Ashaju gives us a summary of today's trading activities.
Thank you for joining us on the Stock Market Report. The market returned to the negative territory today after a mix of profit-taking and sell pressure hits the medium and large-cap stocks, leading to a drag in the key benchmark index by 1.32%. There was profit-taking on Dangote Cement and Bua Cement under the industrial goods sector, and Guinness and UACN witnessed some capital exits in the consumer goods sector. Activity level improved with dominant transactions on Access Bank, FBN Holdings, and total volume closed a little above 200 million for a value of 3.33 billion naira in 3,381 deals. Market breadth also remained positive, with Jaiz Bank atop a chart of 17 gainers, while UACN got depressed by 10%, coming ahead of some 14 other stocks. And that's your Stock Market Report. I'm Temple Ashaju.
And that's it on Business News. It's back to you, Amarachi. Thanks a lot, PC. A policewoman who is a sergeant has been shot dead while controlling traffic at Eneka roundabout in Rivers State. She was shot dead by a sergeant attached to the Operations Department of the Rivers State Police Command. Police authorities in the state say the sergeant has been arrested, disarmed, and undergoing orderly room trial, while 2 other members of the task force have also been arrested and are being questioned. The State Police Commissioner has also ordered a full investigation into the cause of the killing. Still ahead on the news at 10, first human trial in Europe of a coronavirus vaccine begins in the UK, and more from our London studios and around the world in 5. Stay with us. Welcome back. The UK has begun the first human trial of a coronavirus vaccine in Oxford, the first in Europe. 2 volunteers were injected, the first of more than 800 people recruited for the study. Half will receive the COVID-19 vaccine and half a vaccine which protects against meningitis but not coronavirus. Meanwhile, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa says from May 1st there will be a gradual easing of lockdown restrictions in the country based on a risk-adjusted strategy. And the main news again, the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 today asked those in the front line of the pandemic fight to adequately protect themselves, as over 40 health workers have tested positive for the coronavirus. Also today, the Sultan of Sokoto announced the sighting of the moon, which signaled the beginning of the Islamic fasting period of Ramadan. President Muhammadu Buhari congratulated Muslim faithful and cautioned against acts that will spread coronavirus. Thanks for watching tonight. I am Amarachi Ubani. Stay safe.